Hello there, everyone. If you're watching this video, then you are part of the TTOR Army, an army that is building itself up one subscriber at a time. Now, as you can see from the title of today's video, today we're going to be responding to the liberal leftist so-called Christian Dr. Kevin Young. Recently on X, Dr. Kevin Young posted this absolutely absurd post. He said, "Christian, the Bible is not God, Jesus is God. We do not worship the Bible, we worship Jesus. You can know Jesus without the Bible. The Bible is not necessary for faith. That is all. He is all." Now notice the first thing he said. He said the Bible is not God, Jesus is God. Yes, it is true that Jesus is God. The problem with what you said, Dr. Young, is that I'll bet you $10 that the reason why you know that Jesus is God is because you got that information from the Bible. Or if you got it from a pastor or a Christian leader when you were growing up, that person got it from the Bible. In fact, I will wager that just about every Christian alive on the planet today knows that Jesus is God because it's in the Bible. And no Bible passage is more explicit about Jesus being God than John 8:57 through 59, which says the following. "You are not yet 50 years old, they said to him, and you have seen Abraham. Very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am." At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. So in this passage, especially in verse 58, we see Jesus specifically claim to be I am. I am is the English translation for Yahweh. And if you go to Exodus 3:14, where God and Moses talked at the burning bush, what you discover is that God called himself I am in that passage in Exodus, and yet Jesus is calling himself Yahweh here in the New Testament. So the passage where Jesus claims to be God directly is found in the Gospel of John, which is found in the Bible. Now notice the second thing here that Dr. Young says. He says, you can know Jesus without the Bible is not necessary for faith. This is partially true. It is true that you can know about Jesus without the Bible because there were Roman historians at the end of the first, early second century who wrote about Jesus as a real historical person, and that Jesus is congruent with the New Testament Jesus. This Jesus they wrote about was someone who was considered to be a wise teacher and who performed miracles to bolster his claim to be God. And he was put to death by Pontius Pilate back in the 30s AD, and his followers were still alive at the time of their writings. Of course, the problem with these Roman historians who wrote about Jesus is that even though the Jesus they write about is clearly congruent with the Jesus of the Gospels, they provide very little detail about Jesus. For example, they claim that Jesus was a wise teacher, but they don't tell you what any of his teachings were. The Bible, specifically the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they tell you what Jesus' teachings were. They were more specific about what he taught. The Roman historians wrote that Jesus claimed to be God and performed miracles to support this claim. Of course, they don't tell you what specific miracles he performed, the Gospels do, and they don't tell you how people reacted to his claim to be God, the Gospels do. So while the Roman historians and what they tell you about Jesus is congruent with the New Testament Jesus that is written about in the Gospels, the fact of the matter is that the Roman historians do not provide you nearly as much information about Jesus as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do. Furthermore, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written prior to 70 AD, so that makes the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John the earliest and most detailed documents that we have about the historical Jesus. Traditionally and normally, if you have a document about someone that is more detailed and written earlier than any other documents about that person that come after, that would be considered the prime source of information about that person. That would be considered the most authoritative and reliable. The problem, of course, is that people hate God, they hate Jesus, they hate the gospel, they hate truth in general, so they will reject the gospels as being the most reliable sources of information about the historical Jesus, even though they were written earlier and contain far more detail than the Roman historians' accounts about Jesus. Now, in response to Dr. Kevin Young's post, a person named Sovik Satpathy said in response to him, "You can know Jesus without the Bible. I'd really like to know how. Sincere question. I've seen this statement a lot and I haven't seen much to back it up. Coming from you, I hope you have some proper explanation for it." Dr. Young responded to this individual and said, "The best argument is 300 plus years of the first Christians who didn't have it. They simply had the testimony of other followers and creation itself which attests." And this post by Dr. Kevin Young is a blatant lie. It is such a blatant lie. Yes, it is true that the documents that comprise the New Testament we have today weren't put together into the collection that we call the New Testament until about 300 years after Jesus. But the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written prior to 70 AD. In fact, the entire New Testament, I would argue, was written prior to 70 AD. And the reason why I conclude that is because in the Gospels, Jesus predicted that the temple of Israel would be destroyed in exactly the manner that it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. He accurately prophesied and predicted that event would happen. That event did go on to happen. It's one of the most sure facts of history that we have about the first century, and yet nowhere in the New Testament does anybody go back and say, oh, by the way, the temple being destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD and the way that it was, Jesus said this would happen back in his ministry. No one in the New Testament ever goes back and writes that down or writes something similar to it. Therefore, we conclude entire New Testament was written prior to 70 AD. This means that for over 230 years, all of the individual documents that comprise the New Testament today, they existed and were accessible by Christians. The problem is that they weren't gathered together into one collection until 300 plus years after the events of Christ and his life, and then they were officially put together an official collection called the New Testament. But the documents themselves existed for over 230 years before the New Testament was put together. So this idea that the first Christians for over 300 years didn't have the New Testament scriptures and they simply had the testimony of other followers and creation itself, that is such a blatant lie, I don't know how he sleeps at night. The Christians in the first 300 years had the scriptures that make up the New Testament for most of that time. From 70 AD onward, they had access to the scriptures that are in the New Testament today. Those scriptures simply were not collected together into one collection called the New Testament. But they definitely had access to those scriptures for over 230 years prior to the New Testament officially being put together. When I see people like Dr. Kevin Young claim that people like me are worshiping the Bible and that you can know Jesus without the Bible and you can know that he's God without the Bible, when I see them argue like this, I know what they're trying to do. They are trying to undermine my faith in the Bible as the written authoritative Word of God that tells you everything you need to know about Jesus and salvation and the gospel in general. That is exactly what he's trying to do. Now, in the post right below it, Dr. Young says, "The Bible is helpful, hopeful, God-breathed in a way that gives life. It is not itself the life it gives. I am, not it is. God alone." So he says that the Bible is God-breathed, but then he sits around saying that, the Bible's not God, Jesus is God, and you can know Jesus without the Bible. When you read the scriptures themselves say that they are the inspired, inerrant, authoritative Word of God. Jesus himself in his ministry said that we would be judged by the scriptures. So when Dr. Young talks out both sides of his mouth, saying on one hand, oh, the Bible is helpful and hopeful and God breathed in a way that gives life, and then on the other hand, he completely undermines the Bible, saying that you can know that Jesus is God and that you can have a faith in Jesus without the Bible and that the Bible's not necessary for that, he's so full of crap. He is carrying out the satanic agenda that Satan has been carrying out for a long time, mainly getting people to reject the Bible as the inerrant, authoritative Word of God.